Hello, everyone. Hello. It is a pleasure to be here in Bologna, one of my favorite places in the world. I'm a big foodie, so Bologna is definitely a place for me. So this morning, I would like to change your mind. I don't mean make you reverse a position that you previously held. I mean, I want to literally change your mind. I want to rewire your brain, make you look at things differently. Now, you might think that rewiring the brain is a tricky thing to do, but actually, we rewire our brains all the time, where we see things differently. And once you see these things differently, you can't unsee them. So the classic example is when somebody shows you the arrow in the FedEx logo, right? Between the E and the X, that negative space, the arrow. Most of you have probably seen this. Who's seen the arrow in the FedEx logo? Right, okay. And now, whenever you see the FedEx logo, you can't unsee the arrow, right? Your brain has been rewired to notice the arrow. Most people have seen that. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Toblerone, chocolate. I know Pierre is. Right? And you're familiar with this logo, which is a mountain, but have you also seen the bear in the logo? The bear is on its hind legs. I'll show you. It's like... Who sees the bear? Okay. You will never look at Toblerone quite the same way again. You will not be able to unsee the bear. Consider the duck. A perfectly normal duck. Until somebody, usually the internet, shows you that actually all ducks are wearing dog masks. All ducks are wearing dog masks. And now, when I show you the same picture of the same duck, you cannot unsee that. Now, these are fairly trivial examples of having the way we view the world changed. But throughout history, we've seen bigger examples where our brains have been rewired. Copernicus and his heliocentric model of the solar system. Right? The way we looked at our place in the universe changed after Copernicus and Galileo. Now, nothing physically changed in the world. Right? The Earth always revolved around the sun, not the other way around. But our understanding of our place in the world changed completely after our brains were rewired by Copernicus and Galileo. Or Darwin and his beautiful idea of the theory of evolution. Again, nothing actually changed in the world. Natural selection always existed. But once he had pointed it out to us, we would never see the world in the same way again. I love this notebook, by the way. This is from Darwin's notebooks. And this sketch is the first time you can see this inkling of an idea taking shape. This beautiful, beautiful idea. And what it reminds me of is this sketch on this document. This is Information Management, a Proposal, which is what Tim Berners-Lee presented to his boss at CERN, which was the idea for the World Wide Web. Now, he had to rewire people's brains as well to understand this idea of, instead of having a centralized repository of knowledge, that it would be distributed, that anybody could publish, that there would be no center to this network of documents. That was a pretty crazy idea. And I'm glad he got the go-ahead to build it. You can see what his boss wrote in response to this proposal. Up in the top corner, it says, "Vague but exciting." So Tim Berners-Lee, in a way, had to rewire everyone's knowledge or everyone's brains to understand this idea of a decentralized network of documents. We're so used to it now that you could pull up a website on any computer or device and it doesn't matter what the operating system is, right? But back then, everything was very specific to you needed this computer with this operating system and it's not going to work on this other computer because it has a different operating system, right? Now we take it for granted that it doesn't matter what the operating system is. So we had to, rewire our brains. And as designers and developers, we also had to try and get our heads around this new medium of the web, where things could be very, very different depending on the device accessing the web. What tended to happen was we would look to what we had done before. I don't suppose anybody remembers this book, Creating Killer... Wow, some people remember this book. Okay. Creating Killer Websites by David Siegel. He's the guy who came up with the tables for layout and using 1 pixel by 1 pixel spacer GIF and then giving it different dimensions, right? These were hacks. These were hacks so that we could achieve layout on the web. And they were necessary hacks because at the time we really didn't have any other way of doing it. He has since recanted. He wrote an essay called "The Web is Broken and I Broke It," which is maybe overstating the case. But the point is that people didn't embrace the web as a new medium. People instead took what they knew from the previous medium, which is print, and tried to apply it to the web. So they were kind of fighting against the medium instead of truly understanding it. And back in 2000, John Alsop talked about this in A Tao of Web Design. So this article is 14 years old. Who's read A Tao of Web Design? Okay, a few people. Your homework is to read A Tao of Web Design. And yes, an Italian translation exists of this article. 14 years old, and yet it's more relevant today than the day it was written. Because essentially what John is talking about is how we should embrace the web as its own medium, instead of talking about killer websites being desktop publishing on the web. But John points out that this isn't anything new, this way that we take what we know from before, from a previous medium, and we apply it to a new medium. This happens all the time. When radio was invented, and it wasn't Marconi, it was Tesla. When radio was invented, people started doing theater, but on the radio. And when television was invented, people started doing radio on television. And it always takes a while for each new medium to develop its own vocabulary, for people to truly understand this new medium. This is something that Scott McCloud also talked about in his wonderful book, Understanding Comics. Different medium, but the same fundamental issue was there, that people were taking their knowledge from a previous medium and attempting to apply it to a new medium, instead of, changing the way you look at what you're building. When you think back to the Web Standards Project, we mostly think about the work they did in terms of changing browser behavior, right? Encouraging the browsers to support the standards and to have interoperability. But that was actually only half of their work. The other half was changing developer behavior and designer behavior, getting developers and designers to understand the web, right? To stop using tables for layout and spacer GIFs and start using CSS and other web standards. So effectively, they were trying to rewire the brains of designers and developers. And I know that books like Jeffrey Zeldman's book literally did that. I know people who said they were different after reading this book, that it changed their brains, that they didn't look at web design in quite the same way again. And the fundamental message, I guess, that was coming across was to try to separate out presentation and structure, which up to that point had been locked into HTML, to separate it out into these two different layers, right? You have CSS for presentation, you have HTML for structure. And we could talk about this and try to explain to developers this is the fundamental message we're trying to get across. But to really rewire people's brains, you need to show them. And this was a machine for rewiring people's brains. You remember the first time you saw the CSS Zen Garden? And it's like, oh, now I get it. It's literally the same document, but the presentation is changing completely. That you can separate out presentation from structure. That rewired people's brains. So we have our CSS for presentation, we have our HTML for our structure. That leaves one more part to the stack, and that's having our JavaScript for our behavior. And this idea of having these separate layers, one built on top of the other, is the fundamental idea of progressive enhancement, right? It's the idea that you would start with your structural layer, which is HTML, then you have your presentation, which is CSS, and then you have your behavior, which is JavaScript. Layers, building on top of one another. And this idea of these layers reminds me of something I read about in an architecture book, How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand, where he talks about shearing layers. Now he's talking about the different time scales that each layer of a building occupies. That the site of a building, well, we're talking in geological time scales. Whereas the structure itself, is going to be hundreds of years, one would hope. And as you get, further into the layers, you're talking about changing things potentially on a daily basis, right? Moving stuff around inside a room. But what I also take from this is that each layer depends on the layer before. You can't move stuff around inside a room until you have a room. You can't have a room until you have a site, right? And on the web, I think it works in a similar way, or it should work in a similar way. And we have our structural layer on the web with HTML. And there's a wonderful property to HTML that I think we take for granted, and that is the fact that HTML is fault tolerant. To explain what I mean, this is the default behavior for an element in HTML. You have an opening tag and a closing tag, and a browser displays what is in between the opening and closing tags. Okay. What's interesting is what happens when you give it an element that the browser doesn't understand, an element that doesn't even exist. It still just shows the content between the opening and closing tag. Okay? What's crucial here is what doesn't happen. The browser does not throw an error. It doesn't confront the user with an error message. The browser does not stop rendering at this point and render no further. It just displays what's between the opening and closing tags and carries on. Right? It recovers very quickly. There was an error, but the user is not confronted with it. So there's this very sort of lax error handling in HTML, and that is hugely powerful. Because that means we can start adding new elements to HTML, secure in the knowledge that the default behavior in older browsers will be to show the content. Or we can start adding new elements where we don't want to show what's between the opening and closing tags in newer browsers, but now we know that older browsers will show what's between the opening and closing tags, and so we can put our fallback content in there. Canvas, audio, video, the new picture element, right? You can make use of this fault-tolerant error handling in HTML to extend HTML itself. That's what's allowed HTML to evolve over time. I mean, in many ways, the HTML of today is very, very different to the HTML that Tim Berners-Lee came up with when he invented the web, right? And it was a handful of elements, and now we have many more. But in another way, it's an unbroken line. It's still the same language. It's evolved a lot, but it's fundamentally the same. And because of this fault-tolerant nature of HTML and this default browser behavior, it's allowed HTML to evolve, and that allows us to practice structural honesty. And by structural honesty, this is another architectural term, I mean that we can use the right materials when we're building on the web. Instead of faking it, instead of creating a facade, when we were using tables for layout, that wasn't structurally honest, right? An example of structural honesty would be if you have a button, use the button element. Using a span or a div to achieve, the styling and behavior of a button, you can get that to work, but why bother? And also, it's just not structurally honest, right? It's structurally dishonest. So that's HTML, and then we have CSS for our presentation, and like HTML, CSS is also fault tolerant, and this is hugely advantageous for allowing CSS to continually grow and evolve too. If you think about every bit of CSS that's ever been written, it falls into one simple pattern. You have a selector, you have a property, and you have a value. We have a little bit of special characters for syntax, but that's basically it. Selector, property, value. All the CSS that's ever been written, ever. And here's the error handling model for CSS. If you present a browser with a selector that it doesn't understand, it just won't execute whatever's between the opening and closing braces. Again, it will not throw an error. It will not stop parsing the CSS file and refuse to parse any further. It will simply skip on to the next rule. If you give it a property it doesn't understand, it just ignores that particular declaration. Likewise, if you give it a value it doesn't understand, it just ignores that particular declaration. It does not throw an error. It does not stop parsing. So again, that allows us to add to CSS constantly over time, give it new selectors, give it new values, give it new properties, right? That allows us to be materially honest, another architectural term. This idea that you can achieve what you're trying to do using CSS properties intended for that. If you want rounded corners, you use border radius. You do not inject 4 divs with a background image of one slice of a circle to try and get your rounded corners. That's not – that's not materially honest. It's not structurally honest, right? Now you might be thinking, okay, yeah, but then that's not going to look the same in every browser, but that is absolutely fine. What you need to remember is every time that you write a line of CSS, you are not dictating the appearance. You are suggesting the appearance, right? CSS, every CSS rule is a suggestion. So we have this fault-tolerant nature in CSS, just like in HTML. It allows CSS to evolve, just like HTML. We can start using new properties straight away, even if they're not supported in older browsers, because of the error handling. We know how older browsers are going to behave. Then we get to JavaScript, and JavaScript is not fault-tolerant. If you write something wrong in the JavaScript, or you use some JavaScript that the browser doesn't understand, it will throw an error. It will stop parsing the JavaScript and parse no further. So that's problematic. That means that JavaScript is a little more brittle than CSS or HTML. Doesn't mean we shouldn't use JavaScript. I'm a big fan of JavaScript. It just means we need to be a bit careful about how we use JavaScript. Essentially what it comes down to is using safe defaults. Thinking about, well, what happens if something does go wrong with the JavaScript? What's the worst that can happen? And kind of think of JavaScript as being like the electricity of the web, right? Wiring it up, making it awesome. But you also need to consider what happens when there's a power cut. What happens when the electricity isn't available, right? Just as in physical product design, you want something to work when electricity isn't available, but work better when electricity is available. Jake Archibald talked about this, riffing off the Mitch Hedberg joke. When an elevator fails, it's useless. When an escalator fails, it becomes stairs. And on the web, we should be building escalators, not elevators. Because the point here is, go crazy, use JavaScript, it's wonderful, but don't rely on JavaScript. There's a difference between reliance and using JavaScript. If you rely on JavaScript, you've effectively got a single point of failure. This is Instagram.com if JavaScript isn't enabled. It has finished loading at this point. And it's very easy to, switch off JavaScript in your browser and go to a bunch of sites like this and see that actually nothing loads because they're relying on JavaScript. But this isn't actually the point. Switching off JavaScript, that use case is very, very, very rare. Browsers are making it really hard to disable JavaScript by choice. And yet still, shit happens, right? Operators start injecting JavaScript that might clash with your JavaScript. So something goes wrong with the network. Hey, if you lose a bit of HTML, no problem, it's fault tolerant. You lose a bit of CSS, it's okay, you'll recover. You lose a bit of JavaScript, probably all of your JavaScript is not going to run now. And so the issue isn't with people switching off JavaScript, it's with something happening to the JavaScript, we don't know what. Andy Hume talks about this, saying the point with progressive enhancement, it's not about dealing with technology, not being supported in a particular browser. It's much more about the technology failing. So if you don't rely on JavaScript, you're all set. No, people won't have the best experience without the JavaScript, but it's not going to fail completely. David Slade, he put it more succinctly when he said, look, it's simple. Build your apps so they aren't a twirling shit show of clown horns when JavaScript breaks, which is good advice. My friend Derek Featherstone puts it a little more mildly and cleverly when he says, in the front-end stack, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and ARIA, if you can solve a problem with a simpler solution lower in the stack, you should. Right? It's less fragile, more foolproof, and it just works. And I think there's something to that, right? If there's something you can do in HTML, do it in HTML. If there's something you could do in CSS rather than JavaScript, maybe do it in CSS, animation being the obvious example. If there's something you're struggling to get working in ARIA, but it turns out if you just use the right element, like a heading or a button, then just use the right element instead of using ARIA. All of these different ways of looking at it they're all kind of saying the same thing. And what they're saying is something that's been around for a long time, a design principle called Postel's law. Be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. John Postel, one of the fathers of the internet. So this is also called the robustness principle. Right? If you want to build in a robust way, be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. Absolutely true of the design of web browsers. They are liberal in what they accept, right? The error handling of HTML and CSS. I see the robustness principle in action all the time, even in terms of UX. Let's say you're putting a form on the web. You absolutely want to be conservative in what you send. You don't want to send a big, long form. Send the fewest form fields you possibly can. But when people are inputting into that form, be liberal in what you accept. Don't make people format their phone numbers with spaces or without spaces, right? Accept whatever they give you and deal with it. That's an example of Postel's law in action. I'm kind of fascinated by design principles like this, having principles that we can look to while we're building. I kind of think that every company, every product should figure out their design principles and nail them to the wall. Because especially, building software, we have to understand that just like any other human endeavor, software is built by human beings, and therefore the software will reflect the biases of the human beings that built it. You can't help but imbue what you're building with your own beliefs, whether you want to or not. All software is opinionated. We talk about opinionated software. All software is opinionated. You just have to recognize where its opinions are. In the design process, you might be using a tool like Photoshop. That has opinions. When you create a new Photoshop document, right? Command N, new document, first thing it asks you for, a width and a height. Okay, there's an expectation already being set before you've even started designing, because the software is expecting that that's how you work. And that's influencing the way you work. You need to be aware of that. On the other extreme, if you're using a CMS, a content management system, it may have made assumptions about where this content is going to be displayed, about what kind of devices will be displaying this content. Right? It's baked into the software. If you're using a WYSIWYG editor, right, that comes with biases. So we need to recognize the biases that are inside software. On the web, we've got all sorts of powerful tools, some of them more opinionated than others. Just looking at JavaScript frameworks for a while, you've got Backbone. It's got a relatively light touch. You could use Backbone and progressive enhancement, right? You wouldn't need to necessarily rely on JavaScript. But then you get to tools like Angular and Ember, and they're unashamedly opinionated, where they absolutely rely on JavaScript, where they try and shunt everything into JavaScript, make it that single point of failure, where the HTML is generated in JavaScript. Now, that doesn't match to my design principles, right? Progressive enhancement being the first and foremost of the principles that I like to live by. That does not mean that these are bad tools. These are excellent tools for the right people. These are excellent tools for the people who have principles and philosophies that match the principles and philosophies of the tool. If you believe that it's absolutely fine to generate the HTML using JavaScript, then you should use these tools because they match the way you think. And this is important to remember whenever you're choosing any tool, any library, any framework on the web. Does it match my personal philosophy and design principles? Because if it does, then you're going to work with the tool and you will work faster. And that's what a tool is supposed to do. It's supposed to help you work faster. But if what you believe and what the tool believes, the creators of the tool believes, then you're going to be fighting against the tool constantly throughout. And this is why you can have people saying, oh, this framework rocks, and another person saying, no, that framework sucks. They're both right, and they're both wrong. It depends entirely on the person using the framework. So people are reaching for these tools. I'm just a little worried that they're reaching for these tools without understanding the principles that they're taking on board when they do that. That maybe they're not stopping to think, perhaps I don't believe that JavaScript should be a requirement for somebody to access my content on the web. But I understand why people reach for these tools. I was listening to the Shop Talk Show podcast, and John Resig was a guest, and he was asked about these big monolithic JavaScript libraries. And he said, the thing is that, he said, nobody likes to think that what they're working on is trivial. Right? Our work is hard. We like to think that what we're building is really complex. And so when these tools market themselves as for complex things, then we think, well, I'm building a complex thing. I need that tool, right? Maybe what you're working on isn't as quite as complex as you think when you break it down, right? And look at what you're actually building. I know there are very complex things out there, but I don't think they're as common as we think. And those are tools for building elevators, not escalators. Tom Dale is one of the creators of Ember. And he said, look, JavaScript is part of the web platform. You do not get to take it away and expect the web to work. Now, I disagree with him on this, as you could imagine. Well, part of my disagreement comes with his framing about how we view the web, right? How his brain is wired to view the web compared to how my brain is wired to view the web. Because he sees the web as a platform. This phrase, the web platform, that doesn't sit well with me. This is an example of political language, where the framing of a situation can be subtly altered by the words we use to describe it. So in English, we have terms like collateral damage, friendly fire. Right? These are dishonest terms that obfuscate the meaning that's being conveyed. I'll give you another example. The cloud. I mean, Dad, now that's a bullshit term. I mean, really. Hey, we've got these big, heavy servers sitting in a warehouse in Virginia with wires and pipes, and what do we call it? The cloud. I mean, that's a term that's designed to lie, to obfuscate. It's a very obvious example of political language. But I feel that when we talk about the web platform, we might be doing the same thing without realizing it. Or here's another example. I catch myself doing this all the time. I talk about what you can do in the browser. Browser. Singular. Wait a minute. The whole point of the web is that we've got browsers, plural. I'm trying to change the way I talk about this stuff and trying to remind myself, don't say the browser, say the browsers. It's subtle, but that political language can influence how we think. And the web platform, I get why people would talk about the web as a platform, because it puts the web on equal footing with genuine platforms, like when we used to use Flash, the platform, or when we make iOS apps or Android apps. These are platforms. But the point of a platform is you either have the platform or you don't. It's 1 or 0, 100% or 0%. If I build something in Flash and you have the Flash plugin, you get 100% of what I've built. Or if you don't have the Flash plugin, you get 0% of what I've built. If I make an iOS app and you have an iOS device, you get all of my app. If I make an iOS app and you have a Windows phone, you get none of my app. That's the way platforms work. The whole point of the web is that it's platform agnostic, that it doesn't matter what platform you've got, whether it's iOS or whether it's Android or whether it's Windows or whether it's Mac. This was the fundamental idea of the web that Tim Berners-Lee was trying to drive home to us. Is that, okay, I'm going to build something and you probably won't get 100% of what I intend because of the particular platform or the browser you're using. But you also probably won't get 0% either. If we build in the right way, using progressive enhancement, everyone's going to get something, right? Somewhere between 0 and 100%. That the web is a continuum, not a platform. And to think about the web as a platform is a category error, in my opinion. Joe Hewitt, very smart guy, worked on Facebook mobile app. He said, it's hard not to be disappointed by HTML if you've developed for iOS, Windows, or other mature platforms, as I have. Now here's the thing, if you're going to compare the web to actual platforms like that, then yeah, you probably would come away disappointed, because no individual website could ever be as powerful as one platform-specific app, right? But then what you gain in reach, the fact that everybody, no matter what device or browser they're using, can access what you've built, I think that more than makes up for it. But I understand his disappointment. But what you have to understand, what Joe was talking about here is, at the time, what drove his disappointment is what he was trying to achieve was smooth scrolling on the web. That was the thing that was getting him annoyed. And you know what? Yeah, actually, it is tougher to get smooth scrolling on the web rather than iOS or native, right, using a native app. But when you step back and look at these things that, frankly, native does better, right? All these verbs, swiping and scrolling and tapping and dragging, these are the surface-level implementation details of what people are trying to accomplish. This isn't what people are actually trying to do. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm really looking forward to swiping today. The verbs that matter to people are these. I want to find something. I want to buy something. I want to publish something. I want to share something. So you almost have to look below the surface level verbs and get to, I guess, the semantics of what people want to do. What is it that people are actually trying to do? And you know what? This we can accomplish on the web quite easily. And then we can layer on those other verbs, the swiping and the tapping and the dragging and all of that, as a nice to have, but not essential. These are what's essential. So on the web, you can start with a sort of functional honesty. Just using links and forms, you can enable people, no matter what their browser, no matter what their device, to do these things, to publish, to share, to buy, to find. And then depending on the capabilities of the device, you can give them more. You give them more capabilities, but everybody gets something. That's the whole point of the web. And something that really gets this, I believe, is responsive web design. I see it as an extension of progressive enhancement. If you think about the core definition of responsive web design with the fluid grids and the media queries and the fluid images, effectively, it's a form of progressive enhancement. It's treating layout as an enhancement. If you're doing it right, if you're doing it the mobile first way, with responsive design, layout is an enhancement. And in a way, what Ethan is doing is repeating what John was talking about 14 years ago with the Tao of web design. When Ethan wrote his article, he references John straight away. It's trying to rewire our brains to accept this idea of one web, right? Not a separate mobile subdomain, not a separate subdomain for tablets or fridges or cars or whatever. One URL that adapts to the browser. And this isn't a new idea, this idea of one web. This is an old idea, and this is a new framing of it. Responsive design is Ethan's way of rewiring our brains to accept an idea that's been around for a while. This is the first website ever made, and this is how it would look in a narrow viewport. But you could view it in a larger viewport, or a larger viewport again, or larger again. It's responsive, right? This is something to remember. We always talk about making websites responsive, but if you've got a well-structured HTML document and you display it in a browser, it's responsive already. We then do things to make it not responsive. So that, looking at it that way, right? Changing how you view making websites from, oh, I don't want to make a website responsive, I want to keep a website responsive. That's a rewiring of the brain. That's a different way of looking at it. Then the secret to making good websites is not to screw it up, right? Every time you make a decision with your CSS or your JavaScript, the trick is, will this make it worse than what was there before? And use it judiciously. So again, Andy Hume talked about this, that the web is responsive on its own, by default. We're the ones who've been breaking it. I think in a similar way about accessibility, people talk about how do I make my website accessible? Well, if you've got a well-structured HTML document to begin with, it is accessible, and now your question should be, how can I keep my website accessible? It's a different way of looking at it. But if you're going to embrace this worldview, this way of looking at things, this rewiring of the brains, there's a fundamental question that you have to answer correctly. And it's this. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? Now, luckily, you can find the answer to this question by going to this URL. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com, where you will see the answer, which is clearly no. But that answer will look subtly different depending on the browser you use to visit the website, because this website does not look the same in every browser. So let me just check that we're all on board here. I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? No. Excellent. Said with conviction. And when you do this, a lot of the fears we have now, the dread we have about all these devices and all these different screen sizes and all these different capabilities, that kind of evaporates. And you stop seeing this as being a problem. This isn't something to fear, it's something to be embraced, right? Now you kind of, I test it in my device lab, and like, this site looks completely different on all these devices. Mission accomplished. If your website looks the same in Internet Explorer 6 as it does in Chrome 20 jillion, then you're probably doing something wrong, right? That's a bad code smell, in my opinion. I'll give you an example of a pattern of enhancement, a fairly common one. This will be a navigation pattern. This is one I first saw on Luke Wroblewski's old startup, BagCheck. So you can see there's a trigger for the navigation in the top corner there. And if you hit that trigger, it reveals the navigation. Now what it's actually done is it was simply a hyperlink. It's a hyperlink to the bottom of the document using a fragment identifier. The navigation has an ID, and the href of that link at the top just pointed to the ID. I really like this pattern because it just works everywhere, right? Every single browser understands it. I've used it on one of my side projects. I'd use it all the time. I love the simplicity of it. But here's the thing. I don't have to stop here. This can be my baseline. Every single browser in the world can follow a hyperlink. So this navigation pattern now works everywhere for everybody in the world. Great. Now I can think about how I enhance for more capable browsers. And this is something to remember. There's a bit of a myth about progressive enhancement that if you're doing progressive enhancement, that you're coding for the lowest common denominator and you're going to spend all your time dealing with older browsers. It's the complete opposite. Once I've done this, I've got a solid foundation. I'm now going to spend all my time dealing with the newer browsers, trying out the latest technologies, using the bits of CSS and JavaScript that only work in one or two browsers. Progressive enhancement isn't about dealing with older browsers, it's dealing with the newer ones and the newer technologies. Technologies that aren't even supported yet. So here's an example of a site where I'm using that navigation pattern. There's a few different navigation links. You can see there's a search button there, there's a more link with an arrow next to it, and there's that kind of hamburger icon menu, right? Now in each case, I've just made them hyperlinks that point to the bottom of the document. There's an ID for search, there's an ID for more, there's an ID for the menu. And that works, it works in every browser, but now I can go crazy. Now I can use CSS and JavaScript, manipulate the DOM, add animations, so that when you hit the search button, I want that search to slide in from the top, right? With CSS, we can move things around very easily these days, right? When you hit that more link, I want to have an overlay. I want to display that on top of the page. And I can do all this secure in the knowledge that it's not going to affect older browsers, right? When you hit that menu item, I want that to slide in this off-canvas pattern. Right? And I'm doing all this stuff safe in the knowledge that all this works absolutely fine in older browsers too. It's not the same. It does not look or behave the same in older browsers, but that's okay. Web browsers do not need to look the same in every browser. To do this, I need to make sure that the browser is capable of understanding this stuff. So there's this lovely phrase that the BBC and the Guardian are using on their responsive sites. They call it cutting the mustard, right? Seeing if the browser is up to scratch. And in this particular case, in my JavaScript, I'm going to need to use query selector. I'm probably going to need to use add event listener. And because of the error handling model of JavaScript, I can't just go ahead and use those things, because that would throw an error in older browsers. Remember, JavaScript is more fragile. So I have to do feature detection. Right? Say, do you understand query selector? Do you understand add event listener? If so, great. Off I go. I'm enhancing the website. If not, nothing. So there's two important things to look at in this bit of pseudocode here. One, I am not detecting what particular browser this is. I'm not looking at the user agent string. This is feature detection, not browser detection. The other point to note is that there is no else statement with this if statement. I am not polyfilling for older browsers, trying to make them work as if they were newer browsers. Why am I not doing that? Well, because websites do not need to look the same in every browser. It's perfectly okay that the browsers that don't support this stuff don't get it. This is a form of aggressive enhancement, if you will. I think if a browser doesn't support the technology and you're building things the right way with a good solid HTML foundation with layers of CSS and layers of JavaScript, that's absolutely fine. To give you an example, versions of Internet Explorer previous to version 9 do not support media queries. So when I apply CSS inside media queries, thanks to the error handling model of CSS, I know what will happen. Nothing will break. They just won't render those styles, those older browsers. And so Internet Explorer 8, Internet Explorer 7 will not display the layout, which, if you remember, is an enhancement. Layout is an enhancement. How do I deal with Internet Explorer 8 or Internet Explorer 7 or Internet Explorer 6 not being able to run those media queries? I don't. Because websites do not need to look the same in every browser. In fact, let me double check again. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? No. At this point, though, maybe some of you are lying. Because I get it. Because you say, like, yeah, I agree. Websites do not need to look the same in every browser, but my boss, my client, right? And I get how difficult that is. But here's the problem. If your boss or your client thinks that your website needs to look the same in Internet Explorer 8, 7, 6 as it does in the latest Chrome Nightly or the latest Firefox, then there's a problem with how your boss or your client sees the web. And the problem to be solved is having them understand the nature of the web, to rewire their brains. If you then go off and you make your website look the same in Internet Explorer 7 or 8 as it does in the latest Chrome or Firefox, you're not doing your job. That's a cop-out. Your job is to rewire the brain of your boss or your client. And yet we get proud of it. It's like, oh man, awesome. I've got it working exactly the same in IE8 as it does in Chrome 20 jillion. It's like, no, that's not something to be proud of. What a terrible waste of your talents and your time. Right? We should be getting on with it, using these great new technologies and the latest and greatest browsers without leaving anybody behind in the older browsers. And we can do that, and that's amazing. We've been given this fantastic gift with the nature of the web, and we're throwing it away and saying, oh, actually, I'd prefer to treat the web as if it were a platform and everything needs to look exactly the same. Am I saying I don't support Internet Explorer 8 and I don't support Internet Explorer 7? Absolutely not. I support every browser. I support Internet Explorer 5 and 4. I support Netscape Navigator 3. I support text-only browsers. There is a difference between support and optimization. I support every browser. I optimize for none. That includes the newest, greatest browsers as well. If you find yourself using a WebKit prefix or some prefix JavaScript code that is specifically for one particular browser, so you're optimizing for that browser, a little piece of you should die inside. And I get that this is hard, right? I get that, particularly this bit about convincing your boss or convincing your client. I think that seems like the hardest job of all. I mean, CSS, JavaScript, we can do that. We can figure that out. We figured out responsive images. We figured out all sorts of tough technical problems. The technical problems aren't the hard ones. It's the human problems. It's rewiring people's brains. That's the really hard task. But you can take some comfort in the fact that this has happened before, right? We've been here before. If you had talked to the Web Standards Project, if Jeffrey Zeldman, any of these people, when they were trying to convince web developers to use web standards instead of tables for layout, he said, well, it's never going to happen. It's an impossible task, but we can try. And yet here we are. It happened. I was amazed when Ethan published Responsive Web Design. I thought, okay, well, people are never going to go for this, but I'm going to champion this cause because it aligns with my personal philosophies. And I was amazed to see that over time, it started to work. People did get on board with it. So right now it might seem impossible to make your client or your boss understand that websites do not need to look the same in every browser. But it's so important. Human nature is a tough problem. Right? Changing human behavior is a really tough problem. But it can be done. Now, ironically, if you're trying to build for the latest and greatest browsers, you're trying to build for future browsers that we don't even understand, ironically, the best way to do that is to start with a really basic foundation of good old-fashioned HTML, layering on your CSS, layering on your JavaScript. It's a bit of a paradox, but the best way to be future-friendly is to be backwards compatible. And I know people who think that progressive enhancement is a technique of the past, right? That we've gone beyond progressive enhancement. That's old school. But in all my years of making website, it's the one way of looking at the world that has held true. I remember when Ajax came along and people said, well, we can throw everything out the window. It's a paradigm shift. Everything's entirely different now. And I thought, no, actually, you can use Ajax and progressive enhancement to get the best of both worlds, right? That's the great thing about progressive enhancement. You build for the future without leaving the past behind. Now, I showed you the world's first website earlier. And I showed you that in a modern web browser. And it worked. I can pull up a website that's over 20 years old in a browser that was released this week, and that browser will display it. That's amazing. I mean, in terms of computer formats and longevity of files, that's absolutely amazing. That does not happen with other formats. Now, on the web, that can happen if you're doing it right. Here's what's more amazing. You could publish a website today that would still work in a browser from 20 years ago. This is what the original website would have looked like at the time. Completely different to how it would look now in a modern browser, but it still works. And what you're building today could still work in a browser like this. It's not going to look the same. It won't have any of the JavaScript enhancements. Heck, it won't have any of the CSS enhancements. But people could access what you're building. That is a truly amazing idea. And once you really have rewired your brains to get your head around that, I saw a tweet go by. This guy said, wow, you really don't get the momentous idea of the web until you sit next to a guy with an old Nokia and another with a brand new iPad. Right? I mean, that's amazing. Techniques change, technologies change over time. The computers I've had to build my website, they've changed constantly, but my website remains HTML with some CSS and some JavaScript. And it's going to continue to work into the future, and it works in the older browsers. That is an idea that is worth rewiring your brain for. Thank you.